Aging isn't what it used to be, not just in how it looks, but in how it feels. For many, the later years of life bring unfamiliar emotions, stillness, reflection, even a subtle sense of loss or confusion. But what if aging is not a decline, but a deep transformation? Carl Jung, one of the most influential voices in modern psychology, believed that the second half of life is not about holding on. It's about letting go. It's a time not for building the ego, but for returning to the soul. His insights offer quiet guidance, especially for those in their 60s, 70s and beyond, those who are ready to stop performing and start listening within. Here are 5 Jungian ideas that can help you move through aging, not with fear, but with meaning. Insight 1. The second half of life has a different purpose. For much of life, the individual is consumed by the task of becoming. There are careers to shape, families to support, identities to form. In the first half of life, the outer world demands attention, and rightly so. Success, stability, reputation, and contribution feel central. Time feels abundant, and the self is built by what is accomplished. Carl Jung understood this phase not as a distraction, but as a necessary construction of the ego, a foundation upon which life must initially stand. But there comes a point, often quietly and without clear warning, when that external striving loses its clarity. What once felt essential begins to feel burdensome. The old rewards bring less joy, and a soft but persistent question begins to arise from within. What is all of this for? This moment marks the beginning of a profound transition, one Jung saw as the threshold into the second half of life. Unlike the first half, which is about expansion, expression, and identity, the second half has a different purpose entirely. It is not about addition, but subtraction. Not about building, but deepening. Not about seeking more, but understanding what already lives within. In this new phase, the soul begins to speak more loudly than the ego, and the work that now calls is inward, not outward. The shift often begins subtly. A restlessness in activities that once felt fulfilling. A fatigue in repeating roles that no longer feel alive. A growing sense that time is not limitless, and that what remains must matter in a different way. People begin to value meaning over momentum, presence over performance. They want their days to feel honest, not just productive. They start letting go of old ambitions, of social masks, of inherited expectations, not in bitterness, but with a kind of grace. Jung called this a psychological turning inward, a movement toward individuation. Individuation is not a retreat from the world. It is a return to the self. It is the process of integrating all parts of who a person is, not just the socially acceptable traits, but also the forgotten, repressed, and mysterious aspects of the psyche. It is in this integration that a person begins to experience wholeness, perhaps for the first time. The second half of life invites this deeper form of becoming, not the becoming of something new, but of something truer, a becoming that emerges from within, without the need for external validation. This transition is not always smooth. It can feel like loss. The shedding of identity is often uncomfortable. Roles dissolve, goals shift. Even relationships may stretch under the weight of this internal movement. But beneath the discomfort lies a calling, one that says life is not over. It is simply changing form. The ego, once necessary for survival and structure, is no longer the master. Now, the soul begins to guide the way, and its path is slower, deeper, more intuitive. In this phase, many find themselves craving solitude, reflection, and simplicity. The pace of life softens. The need to be understood by others weakens. What grows is the desire to understand oneself. Questions become less about doing and more about being. Who am I beneath what I do? What have I not yet said yes to? What have I spent years avoiding? What still brings me alive? These are not philosophical questions for amusement. They are calls to truth, and they arise not from fear, but from readiness. Jung believed that aging offers an opportunity, not to resist time, but to collaborate with it. The second half of life becomes a sacred unfolding, a space where the unconscious is finally heard, where meaning is no longer borrowed from culture, but discovered from within. It is not about solving problems, but understanding patterns. It is not about achieving goals, but integrating experience. The reward is not applause, it is peace. In this sense, aging becomes a spiritual journey, not because it adheres to any dogma, but because it asks the soul to take the lead. The search for approval gives way to the search for authenticity. Legacy becomes less about what one leaves behind and more about how one lives in the present. It is a shift from accumulation to clarity, from striving to stillness, from reaction to reflection. And it is in this stillness that many discover something surprising, that the self they have been chasing all their life was not ahead of them, but quietly waiting behind. In the pause, in the surrender, in the listening, they find not emptiness, but essence. They do not become less, they become whole. This is the quiet gift of the second half of life. A chance to lay down the burden of performance, to step away from the stage, and to enter the vast luminous interior of the self. It is not a decline, but a deepening. And though it may be less visible to others, it is no less important. In fact, it may be the most important work of all. Because what is cultivated here, in silence, in presence, in authenticity, is not just for the self. It becomes the offering, the wisdom, the presence that others feel even if they cannot name it. To age, then, is not to disappear. It is to arrive at the place where life is no longer about who one has been, but who one truly is. Insight 2. Aging invites the process of individuation. As time unfolds and the seasons of life shift, aging begins to carve a new rhythm into the inner world of a person. What once seemed essential fades gently into the background, and the voices that once directed one's path grow quieter, even distant. This softening of external pressures leaves behind an open space, a space that does not ask to be filled with more doing, but invites a deeper kind of listening. Carl Jung saw this transition not as decline, but as initiation. He believed that aging initiates the soul into the process of individuation, the journey toward becoming whole. Individuation is not a concept rooted in productivity or performance. It does not belong to the marketplace or the stage. It is not concerned with roles or approval. Rather, it is the quiet and often invisible work of drawing together the many aspects of the self, both known and hidden, into a deeper harmony. It is the soul's movement toward integration. In the first half of life, this process is often delayed because the world demands construction of identity, of structure, of stability. But in the second half, when the scaffolding of personality has been built, life begins to ask a different question. Not, who should I become? But who am I, truly and fully? Aging invites this question with a steady hand. It brings the experiences, the losses, the memories, and the turning points that begin to strip away the unnecessary. There is less time to pretend, and less energy to perform. What remains is something rawer and more real. This is where individuation begins, not with achievement, but with surrender. Surrender to what has always been within, quietly waiting beneath the surface of identity. The process does not unfold in dramatic moments, though it can be catalyzed by them. It is usually subtle, a gradual awakening to forgotten feelings, a gentle revisiting of childhood instincts, a new appreciation for solitude, an unexpected grief or joy that reveals a part of the self once buried. Jung understood that the self is not a static image, but a dynamic totality. And individuation is the long, inward turning toward that totality. In aging, there is a softening of the boundaries that once kept the psyche tightly organized. The unconscious becomes more accessible, not through force, but through openness. One becomes more receptive to symbols, to dreams, to intuition. The pace of life slows, and in that slowing, reflection becomes possible. Regret and acceptance share the same table. Memory becomes less linear, more archetypal. Patterns emerge, and with them, meaning. The individuation process invites one to look inward not with judgment, but with curiosity. It asks for a dialogue between who we think we are and who we've always been underneath the surface. It is not about perfection. In fact, it is precisely through embracing imperfection that integration happens. The parts of the self that were once rejected or neglected, fear, grief, desire, creativity, weakness, begin to find a voice. Not to take over, but to join the whole. And the more those parts are acknowledged, the more peace one begins to feel. There is no longer a war between the inner world and the outer mask. For many, This is the first time in life when the soul feels safe enough to emerge. Earlier years were too noisy, too filled with expectation. But aging brings a kind of permission to stop striving, to stop hiding, to start listening. And in that listening, the voice of the self, the true self, becomes clearer. It is not loud, but it is steady. It speaks not in commands, but in longings. It asks not for control, but for alignment. The beauty of individuation is that it is unique to each person. There is no single path, no universal goal. The destination is wholeness, not sameness. It is a return to one's own center, a reuniting with the soul's original design. And it is never too late. The psyche continues to grow and change until the last breath. Jung believed that even in the final years of life, the soul is not finished evolving. In fact, the later years may be the most spiritually fertile time of all, not despite age, but because of it. In this process, suffering can become a teacher, not in a punitive way, but as a mirror. Pain shows where something has been left behind. Loss reveals what truly matters. Solitude uncovers the richness of the inner life. Dreams become doorways. Old wounds become invitations to deeper compassion. The person begins to see themselves not as broken, but as unfolding. Individuation also brings with it a growing disinterest in superficial conflict. There is less urgency to be right, and more willingness to be real. Conversations take on new depth. Relationships simplify. Time becomes too precious for pretense. In its place grows an authenticity that others can feel, even if they don't fully understand it. It is the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needs to impress, because they are finally at home in their own being. Aging makes this possible by taking away the outer distractions, not as punishment, but as refinement. The body changes, and with it comes a deeper listening. Energy shifts, and what once seemed important begins to fall away. The soul, having waited patiently beneath the personality, now takes its rightful place in the center of awareness. And the person, no longer trying to be anything but themselves, discovers a kind of freedom that could never have come earlier. Individuation is not a luxury of the privileged or the wise. It is a natural movement of the psyche toward wholeness. It begins whenever the person is ready to stop becoming someone and start returning to who they've always been. Aging offers the invitation. Solitude creates the space. Reflection provides the map. And the soul, long patient, always present, offers its quiet guidance, not to a perfect life, but to a meaningful one. Not to a new self, but to a whole one. Insight 3. The shadow must be made conscious. In every human life, there exists a space that remains hidden, sometimes for decades, sometimes for a lifetime. This space, Carl Jung called the shadow. It is not darkness for its own sake, nor is it evil. Rather, it is composed of everything a person has learned to hide in order to survive, succeed, and be accepted. In the first half of life, the formation of the ego and the performance of socially approved roles often leave little room for the full range of human emotion and experience. So, the shadow is born, not as an enemy, but as a container for what could not yet be faced. The shadow holds many things: desires that were shamed, anger that was suppressed, sadness that was ignored, and even joy that felt inappropriate. These aspects of the self do not disappear. They are simply exiled to the unconscious, stored away in silence. But what is not seen does not vanish. What is repressed remains active beneath the surface, influencing thoughts, choices, and reactions in subtle and often confusing ways. And as Jung warned, what is not made conscious appears in life as fate. As a person ages and the performance of the outer world begins to lose its grip, the shadow starts to press forward. This is not regression, it is invitation. Aging offers the psychic space to confront what was once avoided. No longer pushed by the demands of youth or the urgency to prove, the older individual begins to turn inward. And in that turning, the shadow becomes more visible. It shows up in dreams, in sudden waves of emotion, in old memories that return without warning. It may feel unsettling at first, but it is also necessary. To make the shadow conscious is not to be overwhelmed by it. It is to meet it with honesty and compassion. The parts of the self that were once rejected begin to step forward, not to destroy, but to be included. A forgotten grief may ask to be felt. A long-denied need may finally ask to be met. These moments, though sometimes painful, are signs of movement, of the soul seeking wholeness. And it is precisely in this meeting that healing begins. What was once feared begins to transform. What was once shameful becomes human. And what was once split apart begins to reunite. This integration is the heart of individuation. Jung did not propose that we eliminate the shadow. He believed we must embrace it, recognize it, and let it find its place within the totality of who we are. For it is only through the union of opposites, light and dark, strength and vulnerability, joy and sorrow, that the self becomes whole. The aging process makes this work not only possible, but essential. Because without it, the soul remains divided, and the person feels a vague sense of emptiness, no matter how many achievements or possessions they may hold. Making the shadow conscious does not mean acting out every repressed emotion or indulging every past impulse. Rather, it means recognizing their presence, understanding their origin, and allowing them to be held in awareness. A person might begin to understand that their lifelong anxiety was not weakness, but the result of never having a safe space to express fear. Or that their difficulty with anger was not because they were bad, but because they were taught early that anger made them unlovable. These realizations do not change the past, but they change the relationship to the past. And in that shift, freedom grows. Jung often emphasized the role of dreams in revealing the shadow. As the conscious mind softens with age, dreams become more vivid, more symbolic, more insistent. Animals, strangers, storms, lost homes. These are not just images, but messages from the unconscious. They carry the contents of the shadow, coded in metaphor, asking to be felt, understood, and welcomed, to record dreams, to reflect on their emotional charge, to sit with their mystery without trying to solve them. This is part of the shadow work that aging makes possible. Relationships also become mirrors for the shadow. The qualities we dislike most in others are often reflections of what we cannot yet accept in ourselves. This is the process of projection, another core idea in Jungian psychology. By examining strong emotional reactions, especially those that feel disproportionate, a person begins to see not only others more clearly, but themselves. The shadow is not always ugly. Sometimes it contains creativity, sensuality, power, and joy. Aspects that were hidden not because they were wrong, but because they felt too risky to show. The path of making the shadow conscious is not linear. It happens in layers. One insight opens to another. One painful memory gives way to a moment of compassion. One difficult emotion eventually softens into wisdom. And over time, the shadow begins to lose its weight. Not because it is gone, but because it is no longer denied. The person begins to feel more whole, more honest, more rooted in reality. They no longer need to maintain a perfect image. They are no longer afraid of their own depth. In the later stages of life, this work becomes sacred. Not because it leads to fame or fortune, but because it leads to truth. A truth that has been waiting quietly beneath the surface for decades. A truth that says, you are not broken, you are complex, you are vast, and everything you've hidden was a part of your becoming. To grow old, then, is not to diminish, it is to deepen, to shed the illusions of youth and to step into the fullness of being. The shadow, once feared, becomes a guide, not to darkness, but to integration, not to shame, but to humanity. And in that integration, a peace emerges, not the peace of avoidance, but the peace of self-acceptance. It is the peace of knowing that nothing within you was ever truly unworthy. It simply needed time, space, and courage to be seen. Insight 4. External struggles are replaced by inner depth. In the earlier chapters of life, the outer world dominates. There are careers to pursue, families to raise, ambitions to chase, and identities to construct. The rhythm is fast, the focus is outward, and the rewards are tied to recognition, achievement, and affirmation from others. Life feels like a constant movement forward, a striving towards something just out of reach. The psyche during these decades is primarily extroverted, meaning it takes energy from the external world. Carl Jung understood this phase as necessary for the development of the ego. the conscious sense of self that learns to navigate society and define boundaries. But Jung also taught that at a certain point, this outward striving must give way to something else. Not because one has failed, but because one has grown. Aging offers the natural and psychological pivot from outer struggle to inner depth. When the battles of early adulthood are no longer urgent, when the job is done or no longer essential, when the children are grown, when the striving for approval quiets, there emerges a kind of space. In that space, many begin to feel a strange discomfort, often mistaken for loss. But it is not loss. It is the invitation to descend, not in a negative sense, but in the spiritual sense, to go downward and inward into the soul. This descent is not a retreat from life, but a deepening into it. The energy that once went into building a life externally now turns inward, and the inner world, long neglected or postponed, begins to call. The call may come through restlessness, through dreams, through long-forgotten feelings that rise unexpectedly. One may find themselves reflecting more, speaking less, or feeling drawn to silence, nature, slowness. This is not a sign of decline. It is a sign that the soul is beginning to breathe again. External struggle often requires noise, assertion, and momentum, but inner depth asks for stillness, surrender, and attention. It asks for a shift in values, from quantity to quality, from productivity to presence, from status to meaning. Where once a person measured success by what they did or owned, they now begin to measure it by how deeply they understand themselves and how honestly they live. The questions change. It is no longer, what can I achieve? But, what can I understand? It is no longer, how can I be seen? But, can I see myself clearly? These questions arise not out of insecurity, but from maturity. They are not signs of failure, but of readiness. As external goals fade in urgency, the psyche begins to unfold in more symbolic and intuitive ways. Jung believed that the unconscious becomes more active in the second half of life, not because it was absent before, but because there is finally space for it to emerge. Without the constant pursuit of outer rewards, a person can listen more carefully to dreams, to instincts, to the quiet signals of the inner life. This shift is not passive. It requires courage to face one's own interior without distraction. But in that facing, a richness is found that no outward success can provide. The shift from outer struggle to inner depth often comes with a reordering of priorities. Relationships become more meaningful, but fewer. Time becomes more sacred. One becomes less interested in debate and more drawn to understanding. Where once there was urgency, now there is patience. Where once there was comparison, now there is contentment. And often, what arises is gratitude, not just for what has gone right, but even for what went wrong, because it too shaped the soul's path. This is not to say that the external world no longer matters. It does, but its grip loosens. The person is no longer defined by external markers. They do not need the same affirmations to feel secure. They may still work, still contribute, still engage, but not from the same place. Now their motivation is rooted not in proving, but in offering, not in climbing, but in grounding. The external struggle is replaced not by withdrawal, but by a quieter, steadier kind of presence. And in this presence, something new and old is discovered: the self. Not the ego self, which was necessary in early life, but the deeper self, the one who was always watching, always waiting, always intact beneath the layers of performance. Jung believed that connecting with this deeper self is the true goal of life, not just surviving or succeeding, but becoming whole. And wholeness requires going inward. It requires facing not just the light, but the shadow, not just memories, but emotions, not just questions, but mysteries. As this shift unfolds, many find themselves less reactive, more contemplative. They notice beauty more easily. They are moved by simple things: a bird in the garden, a well-worn book, a quiet conversation. They may speak less, but listen more. They may spend more time alone, not out of loneliness, but because solitude has become a friend. This inward turn is not a withdrawal from life, but a deepening into it. What is shed is not life itself, but the need to chase it. The soul, Jung taught, grows through inner attention. And aging is the season in which this growth becomes central. No longer distracted by the outer race, the person can now enter the quiet cathedral of their own interior. And there, they find not emptiness but depth, not silence but song, not confusion but clarity. This is the great gift of aging, the replacement of struggle with depth. Not because life becomes easy, but because the person becomes anchored. They are no longer chasing something outside of themselves. They are resting within. And in that rest, a new kind of strength is born. A strength not of force, but of presence. Not of pushing, but of knowing. To grow older, then, is not to be diminished, but to be deepened. It is not to disappear, but to arrive fully, quietly, and truly as oneself. Insight 5. Dreams become guides for the soul. In the quiet hours of the night, when the world falls still and the conscious mind releases its grip, a different kind of voice begins to speak. It does not use language in the ordinary sense. It speaks through symbols, sensations, and images that defy logic. This voice comes from the unconscious, and it makes itself known through dreams. For Carl Jung, dreams were not meaningless or random events. They were messages, direct communications from the deeper layers of the psyche. And in the later years of life, these messages grow even more significant. They become less about the outer world and more about the soul's journey inward. As the distractions of the external world begin to fade with age, the inner life starts to take up more space. The psyche, now less burdened by roles and obligations, opens more readily to the unconscious. And with this opening, dreams can become more vivid, more emotional, and more symbolic. They may carry echoes of childhood, unresolved moments from decades past, or entirely unfamiliar scenes that feel strangely important. These are not hallucinations. They are part of a deeper dialogue, the psyche's effort to speak to itself. Jung saw dreams as natural expressions of the process of individuation, the journey toward becoming a whole person. Each dream, in this view, contains a piece of information that the conscious mind has not yet fully integrated. It might be a feeling that was never expressed, a fear that was never faced, a talent that was never developed, a longing that was buried. The dream doesn't deliver this information like a textbook. It delivers it like a poem. One must sit with it, feel it, and return to it over time. The meaning is not always immediate, but the more a person pays attention to their dreams, the more fluent they become in the symbolic language of the soul. In later life, dreams often change in tone and content. They may become slower, more reflective, even more archetypal. One might dream of walking through ancient forests, encountering unknown animals, or revisiting places from the past in surreal forms. These dreams are not meant to be decoded like puzzles. They are invitations. They ask the dreamer to reflect, to feel, to wonder, and most importantly, to listen. Dreams become guides, not because they give clear answers, but because they offer truth in a different form. A truth that the rational mind might reject, but the soul recognizes instantly. Many people find that recurring dreams begin to appear as they age. A particular figure returns, a certain path is walked again and again, a specific atmosphere repeats. These repetitions are not meaningless. They are persistent nudges from the unconscious, asking for acknowledgement. Perhaps the dreamer has not yet faced an old wound, or perhaps a part of their personality, what Jung called the anima or animus, is asking to be integrated. Or perhaps the dream is simply offering companionship in a time of transition, reassuring the dreamer that even in solitude, they are not alone. Some dreams bring a kind of spiritual clarity that is difficult to describe. They may feel sacred even if they contain no religious imagery. Jung believed that the psyche is inherently spiritual, not in the sense of adhering to a specific belief system, but in its longing for wholeness and connection to something greater than the individual ego. Dreams, in this sense, become bridges between the finite and the infinite. They connect the day-to-day life of the person with the timeless movements of the soul. Recording dreams can be a powerful practice in this stage of life, not for analysis or judgment, but for relationship. Writing them down gives them weight. It says, "I'm listening." Over time, themes may emerge. A sense of inner guidance becomes more clear. A conversation between the conscious and the unconscious begins to take shape. And this conversation is not theoretical, it is deeply personal. It can influence how a person makes decisions, how they view the past, how they relate to others, and even how they face the future. In the final chapters of life, dreams may shift once more. They may begin to include images of departure, of travel, of light, of thresholds. Jung noted that many of his older patients dreamed of journeys, of crossing bridges, of vast landscapes that evoked awe and peace. These dreams are not necessarily predictions. They are expressions of the psyche preparing for transition. And far from being frightening, they often bring comfort. They suggest that the unconscious is not afraid, that on some level, the soul already understands what the ego cannot yet grasp. The relationship with dreams is not about control or certainty, it is about humility, about recognizing that there is more to the self than the conscious mind can access, and that by honoring dreams, one is honoring the fullness of their own being. Jung did not believe that dreams belonged only to psychologists or mystics. He believed they belonged to everyone, especially to those in the later years of life, when the soul finally has room to speak. To take dreams seriously is to take oneself seriously, not in an inflated way, but in a reverent one. It is to admit that the inner life matters, that the invisible is not imaginary, that wisdom can come in the dark, and that guidance can arrive in silence. In a world that often dismisses what it cannot measure, dreams offer something deeply human. They remind the aging person that even as the body changes, the soul continues to grow, that even in the stillness of later life, there is movement, quiet, mysterious, and full of meaning. And so dreams become guides, not loud, not always clear, but faithful. They walk beside the person as they turn inward, as they loosen the grip of old identities, as they prepare for whatever lies ahead. They whisper of truths too deep for words. They carry the voice of the soul, gently calling the person home to themselves.